Hello, and welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 1. As the slides go by, you'll notice at the bottom of each slide, we have a phone number, and at the very end, we'll have a slide with our phone number and email as contact information if you have more questions or you're interested in signing on for assistance or just finding out more about assistance. So yeah, this is a general introduction to or general overview of Chapter 1 of the dissertation. I really urge everybody to get the template for their specific school. While there are commonalities and typical features of Chapter 1s, sometimes schools have their own kind of specific requirements that may differ from what's generally required. So that's always the best place to start and the best place to kind of go back to if you're stuck. Okay, moving forward. Here's what we'll cover today. These again are the typical general features of the Chapter 1, which is the introduction to the dissertation. And it's helpful to think of the Chapter 1 as kind of a blueprint for the study. So in other words, it's going to lay out some of the fundamental pieces. In other words, what are you studying? Why are you studying it? And how are you going to study it? And you get into some more of these things in more depth in later chapters. Chapter 2 is usually the lit review. Chapter 3 is an extended discussion of the methodology. The later chapters are then involve your results and discussion of your results. So this is kind of like the blueprint, how you're going to proceed. And this webinar will focus on the non-method sections of the Chapter 1, and we do run webinars on specifically on developing research questions, specifically on developing hypotheses, specifically on the design and the methods components of Chapter 1. Okay, so the introduction to the introduction. First, obviously, you need to talk about or mention, describe what you're studying, the topic. And usually this includes the social or organizational problem. What is the issue? Use some statistics or some kind of peer-reviewed source to kind of anchor your observation or to get the reader's attention. You also need to introduce the actual research problem. Now you'll talk about the research problem more as the chapter progresses, but you want to introduce it here at the opening section of Chapter 1. In other words, what is the issue in the research, or what is the gap? Why is the study needed? So for example, your organizational problem might be retention of special education teachers, right? Because they're the attrition, they're leaving the profession at a surprising rate. You bring that up, you support that with some kind of statistic or observation, and then the research problem would be the things that we don't know in the research about the retention of special education teachers. Like, are there things that is missing in the research? Is there things that we still need to know? That would be the research problem. Okay, kind of slightly different, but related to the actual organizational problem. Okay. Okay, still part of the introduction to Chapter 1. State what is needed to address the research problem. How is your study designed to address the research problem? And so at the end of the section, if you introduce the organizational problem, you discuss that a little bit, anchor it with some statistics or some observations from the research. Introduce the research problem, why the research is needed to kind of fill this gap or this issue in the research. When your reader finishes the introduction part to the Chapter 1, they should know what you're studying and why. Again, you're going to get into details as the chapter progresses, But the information should be there to give the reader generally a sense of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay. Usually, again, this is a general kind of review of the chapter 1. Follow your school's templates, but generally you'll have a background section, and this is really kind of the background or a sketch of or a summary of some of the major research and some of the issues that have led to the problem. Okay, so there's some historical material here. You don't need a lot of historical material, but really kind of summarizing the trends that have kind of, and the major points that have led to where we are now as far as what we know about the problem and where the research is. Okay, review the research on the problem to date. Again, not an in-depth review, but enough to give the reader a sense of the bigger picture. Focus on major recent trends in the research, what is known about the topic, what research has been conducted on the topic, and that will help to frame and to highlight what we still don't know, what we still need to know, and hence the need for your study. That's where your study will come into. So it kind of funnels down to the specifics of what your study is going to be about. And the research problem, which drives the study. And so it acts as a kind of transition from the background. Again, the background funnels down into your specific research problem. And the research problem section is really a more kind of targeted overview of what needs to be done to address the research problem, what the research has been done in the area, what we still don't know, specifically state the research problem. In other words, is we can come out and say, we need research on blank, or whatever it is that you're conducting your study on. Okay, and states that your study is specifically designed to address the research problem. And another thing I would like to just kind of stop and recommend is, if you can get approved samples or approved dissertations in your area from your school, because you can look at the templates, you can attend webinars, and all this is helpful, but sometimes it's just really especially helpful when you're sitting down to write, to have concrete examples to hand while you're drafting. Typically, this is followed by a purpose statement, the purpose of the research. And usually this is encapsulated in a very specific statement that is framed something like, the purpose of this approach design, for example, the purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between, whatever it is you're looking at. So it captures the kind of specifics of, not only the approach and the design, but also what it's doing in the verb, examining, exploring, investigating. And those terms can be a little general most of the time. But then you're very concrete, what your specific variables are, what the specific concepts that you're going to study. So here's some examples. I have a quantitative example. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. And usually you go on and say, in your specific population, right? Whatever your specific population or the participants you're looking at. And I have a qualitative example here too. The purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore the challenges of African American women as they advance positions as university presidents and again, mention the specifics of your population. And sometimes there's a little more information they want about the purpose, maybe to come out and say, what instruments you're using to measure. But usually the purpose section is pretty cut and dried. It probably usually a paragraph long. Okay, the RQs, obviously there's a section for your RQs. Sometimes it has a little bit of discussion or setup with it. Sometimes it doesn't. You can just list your RQs. Again, follow the specifics of your template. And again, this is not this webinar doesn't focus on the methodological components. So if you are interested in specifically in research question and hypotheses development, we do run webinars specifically on those topics. Usually what comes next is a theoretical framework or conceptual framework. And this basically is, people get thrown with the term framework. Usually it's just the theory or the concepts, if it's quantitative or qualitative, I'm sorry, that kind of serve as the theoretical basis for your study. Okay, people get hung up on theoretical or conceptual. Typically, theoretical framework is used for quantitative studies. Conceptual framework is used for qualitative studies. Don't ask me exactly why that is so, but that seems to be what we've encountered in our experiences. You know, and there's a lot of slippage with these terms, theoretical and conceptual. That I don't think we really need to understand, just to kind of know that basically go with what your chair or your school recommends. But again, typically theoretical for quantitative, conceptual for qualitative. And essentially what you do in this section is you define the theory that you're going to be using. You know, or just come out and say, transformational leadership theory or whatever it is will serve as a theoretical framework for this study. Have a source for that, you know, who developed it, talk about who developed it, define the theory. A lot of people want to move on and start discussing the theory without defining it first. Define the theory. If it has components, make sure you include definitions of the components. You know, these definitions should be anchored by sources, preferably and ideally by, you know, the person who was part of developing the theory. Talk a little bit about what the theory was developed for. You know, what was it developed to explain? How have researchers used it? And then you need to discuss a little bit about how it connects to your theory, or how it will help to explain your results. Okay. And if you're doing a quantitative study, for example, your theory should be associated with the instrument that you're using. So, in other words, if you're studying employee engagement, let's say, there are a couple instruments for, or several, probably a few instruments for studying employee engagement. Now they're defined slightly differently and they may have different components. So if you're using, let's say, instrument B to study employee engagement, you don't want to use theory A for your theoretical framework. You want to use, the instruments are usually associated with a theory or theorists or research. They're backed by that. So whatever instrument you use, you want to use the associated theory and the associated theorist. That's real important to make sure that aligns. Okay, again, I can't stress enough the use of samples or examples as you're doing this, because again, we can talk about it and you can kind of understand it in your head, but when you go to sit down to write, you know, suddenly you're just blank and you're kind of, well, what do they mean by this? And so samples are always helpful. Nature of the study, there's usually a section for nature of the study or study design where you talk about your approach. define the approach you're using, why you're using this approach, and your specific, which is qualitative or quantitative, your specific study design, which is, it's correlational or it's experimental or quasi-experimental, or maybe it's a case study. So the specific design needs to be discussed. And again, this is a methodological component, so I'm going to leave that for the webinars that specifically talk about the methodological components of the chapter. Definitions, usually there's a section where you are required to define the variables and major terms and concepts of your study. Sometimes people want to go overboard on this, that have 20, 30. If you have that many, you have too many. These are really just, you need to definitely define your variables or the factors that you're studying. They definitely require definition. And any major concepts, not that are just really kind of loosely associated with your study, but that kind of directly relate to your study. And these definitions are purely functional. They're not discussions, so they're not extended discussions of the concept. They don't involve multiple definitions. What they are is they're functional definitions of how you are defining this variable, this factor, this idea, this concept for your study. Okay, so they can usually be a sentence, maybe 2 sentences long. They're very concise. For example, employee engagement will refer to blank, however you're defining it for your study. And you need to have these anchored with peer-reviewed sources. Usually more recent sources are better, but sometimes if it comes from a theory, sometimes older sources are fine if it's foundational. But no dictionary, no general dictionary definitions. Definitions need to come from the literature and from peer-reviewed sources, and be like I said, clear and succinct. They're not discussions. Okay. Significance. This is kind of, professors like to call this the so what section of your of the chapter. So in other words, you have something you're looking at, based on a research problem. We don't have a certain kind of information or knowledge about a subject. Okay, that's the research problem. We need this knowledge in the literature. That's why you're conducting your study. And people say, great, well, you're filling a gap in the research. Okay, but who cares? What's the point of it other than just kind of filling the gap in the knowledge, which is great. It's a start, but there needs to be a bigger reason, just a contribution to the research, which is important. But so what are going to be the implications? Not only that it's going to fill the gap in the literature, but what are the implications to the literature? I mean, how might it kind of change the way we think about the topic, or how we approach the topic, or how we do research on the topic? What are going to be, this is kind of two-pronged, what are going to be the practical implications, right? So for people practicing in the area, say if you're doing an education study, it might be teachers, it might be administrators, it might be students. How is the data that you collect, how is the information that you collect going to inform what people do at the level of practice? So what is its significance, or potential at this point, potential significance, because you're not exactly sure how it's going to, what the implications are going to be, or what you're going to get. But it's kind of a place where you discuss potentially, why is this important at the level of research? Why is it important at the level of practice? What can it tell us that can help us, that can inform our research, how we do research? How can it give us information to tell us, how we can practice better? Okay, and sometimes at some schools they want an additional kind of prong to this. I know like Walden University, for example, is big on social change. So like positive social change. And this is school specific. Usually practical significance and research significance is enough. Like I said, Walden also wants the third prong, which is positive social change. So how much your information from your study lead to positive social change? And usually this is, you know, if it's an education study, if it's helping students to be successful, I mean that helps society into having, you know, informed, productive citizens. So just see if that in your sort of specific template is part of the significance. Other sections, I've kind of lumped these together because, again, these school templates, they're required in some, they're not required in others. And these can include things like limitations, section for limitations, where they want you to describe potential weaknesses, potential shortcomings that may have real effects on your results. Sometimes this can be for quantitative studies. You may not be able to get an adequate sample size, so you have a low sample size, which is a problem for quantitative studies. Obviously, we're still in, you know, a situation where COVID is a factor. This may affect if you're going to do qualitative studies, this may affect your ability to do interviews. Obviously, you can do interviews with things like Zoom. So that could be a potential limitation looking forward. So anything that may kind of affect, you know, how you're going to do your study, and specifically how you get your results and affect the analysis of your results. Assumptions. These sections are a little tricky. They're not that difficult and they're not that long, but sometimes they want you to talk about the assumptions that, and this is a good thing to kind of, if you don't know what they are, study assumptions are, you know, go to the literature, look up the definitions. But these are usually things that have to be assumed and taken for granted because you don't have control over them. So for example, a typical assumption in all studies is you have to assume that your participants are going to be honest with you. You don't have control over that. You can reassure them of the confidentiality of the information. You can reassure them of the anonymity of the information, which will help with honesty because, you know, if you assure them and they know that, you know, the material is kept confidential, the responses are anonymous, that will help ensure that you get honest results. But you have to make the assumption, because you can't control it, that you're getting honest and open responses. There's also sometimes a section called scope, sometimes called the limitations. And really this just kind of, it's a place that you kind of reestablish, or you state the boundaries of your studies. It's going, you know, it talks about your population, the geographic location, the setting, you know, what your study is bounded by, what it includes, and consequently what it excludes, or what it doesn't cover. And again, these sections still are real helpful to see examples from approved dissertations. And again, they're not required for all schools. So see your specific templates. Okay, and usually a summary at the end. And just like all summaries, you want to recap the major points of the chapter. Remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed. And you can end by transitioning to the next chapter, chapter 2, which is usually the lit review, and give a kind of a preview of those sections if you want. And that is it. Here's some information about us, our services, contact information if you feel like you'd like to talk to somebody more about what we offer. Get pricing. There's obviously no commitment. You're making no commitment to sign on for work. It's just purely informational. So that's that information, the contact information. Does anybody have any questions at this point that I can answer or help answer? Let's see. Question. I'm not seeing any questions. Yeah, if you have questions, you can type them in the dialogue and the question box. Let me see. Here's a question. Let me read this out loud for everybody. Is it possible to download the PowerPoint, and also can we download the recording? Yes, we will be sending everyone who attends a copy of the PowerPoint. Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions? You can type them in the dialog box. Let me see here. Mika, do you want to type it in, or I've unmuted you? Let me see if I can unmute you. You can talk. Hey, Mika, you have a question? If you could put it in the dialog box. I'm trying to unmute you. You may have to unmute yourself on your end.
Okay, thank you. I'm just joining. I'm wondering if I've missed a lot.
Yeah, well, you missed a whole. I mean, it's done now, but we will send everybody. You will be sent a copy of the PowerPoint and the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
That's pretty cool. Thank you.
Yep. Of course. Yep. Hi, Deanna. Do you have questions? You can unmute yourself if you want. I have you unmuted on my end. Okay, here is, I have a couple questions here in the chat box. Let me get to these. I'll just take them as they came in. I have a section where I need to speak to the history of the problem, previous approach to the problem, and current status of the problem. Can you speak to this, please? Yeah, that would be in the background section. Let me go back to that slide. Right, the person is asking about setting up, the history of the problem, the research that has kind of been done on the problem, where the problem stands now, the research to help set up the need for your study. Yeah, that's all handled in the background, or sometimes called background to the problem, where you kind of summarize some of the major trends in the research, which lets the reader know what's been done on the topic and what still needs to be done and should lead to the need for your study. Okay, thank you for that question, Julie. Is there a good place to get sample papers? Yeah, I mean, the best place is just to go through your school library, to go to ProQuest, and search for, you can probably find your schools, dissertations from schools are published in ProQuest. So that would be the best place. You can also ask your chair. Your chair may have some kind of pet, or not pet, but good recent examples. They usually do. They're usually proud of some of their past students' work, and they're happy to give you examples if you ask them. But yeah, ProQuest would be the place to look for dissertations to look at as examples. Okay, I have another question here from Jonathan. Do we need to discuss the alternate view if available? In other words, include in literature reviews those who disagree with the hypotheses or one of the research questions? Yeah, the place to kind of talk about alternate views would be the lit review. And you want to do it in a way that shows that there are alternative views, but that you know, there's still a need to kind of explore, examine what you're focused on. I mean, you don't really kind of want to undercut your, you know, your argument too much. But yeah, any kind of you know, differing, you know, approaches to the research would be mostly handled in the lit review, because that's where you're going to actually kind of review the research on the topic. So, I mean, you know, what's out there is what's out there, you know, so you're going to have to report on, you know, the various findings on the topic, whatever they are. Okay, it's a good question. No question, thank you. Okay, did I hit all the questions? Okay, and just a reminder, again, check our website for the schedule of the webinars. We do run webinars on different, on all the chapters of the dissertation. We run webinars on specific topics. So, you know, if this one, you know, isn't, you're interested in the methodological, like research questions, hypotheses, that we'll definitely run a webinar on that. So just check back on the schedule to see, you know, if there's something else that you'd like to attend. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions. All right, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and good luck. And again, if you think there's something we can help you with, or you just want to talk and get a little more information about our services, let me get the proper slide up here. Here is our contact information. And again, you will all be sent a copy of the PowerPoint and the presentation. All right, thank you very much for attending. Have a great day.